let's start on climate. You mentioned that COP26 presidency is still held by the UK and will be handing over the baton to COP27. Now, one of the things that could not happen at COP26 in Glasgow was the discussion around loss and damage. This is to do with when climate impacts happen, especially extreme weather events where countries have to tackle the immediate impact of, say, a hurricane or a flash flood. They would like compensation from developed countries, which is part of the Paris Climate Agreement. How is the UK government thinking about those discussions that are going to happen in Egypt in November?
So first of all, can I just start talking about what happened last November? Because I think that it was incredibly important that countries from all across the world came together to make those promises, and they were their promises of how they were going to work towards reducing carbon. Now, the UK, as president of COP, feels a really important role, and I've discussed this with Akshat, a really important role to encourage those countries who've all made these really important promises to actually deliver on them, okay? And we need to be seen to deliver on themselves. So I'm going to leave aside the mitigation, you know, the question you've just had, because that will be very much what ALOC will be working with Egypt on. But also what I've been focusing on is trying to make sure that the promises that we made are also delivered.
Right. Okay.
And so, for example, last week, when we had the COP conference in Côte d'Ivoire on desertification, I was very much saying this is what the UK is doing to see through on our promises and therefore encourage others as well. But yes, you are right. There's huge issues that we have when you see the really adverse impacts. So, for example, I've been in Malawi where I've met young girls whose schools have been washed away by the flood. I've met just tragedy of the drought in Somalia. So one of the things that we as the UK are doing is through our international development strategy, we are increasing back up the amount of money that we spend on humanitarian aid. And that's meant that we've been able to put, for example, more funding into helping the situation in Somalia and those adverse impacts.
And that is, of course, maintaining the level of total funding that's going towards foreign aid. So that was dropped from 0.7% to 0.5%. Yeah. You're saying it'll be shifted towards humanitarian efforts more. So there'll be some cuts happening somewhere else to manage.
So one of the really difficult decisions we had to make during the pandemic, because the pandemic, you know, had such a massive impact on government spending, government budgets, is we had to make a really difficult decision about how we were going to try to restore public finances in the UK. So the decision was made to reduce ODA from 0.7 to 0.5. We've been looking again at how that 0.5 is spent. We announced the new international development strategy yesterday. The Foreign Secretary absolutely passionate that we need to restore back up to the pre-reduction levels what we were investing in humanitarian aid, but also what we were investing in women and girls. The UK is a massive supporter of women and girls across the world. Will never enable countries to get the best performance and economic growth if we don't invest in 50% of the world's population. So this is why girls' education is so key.
Right. And then in terms of investments that are, again, committed to and are being made, there's the massive $8.5 billion deal with South Africa to help it move away from coal. Now, that deal is absolutely key, not just for South Africa, which is 35% unemployment, but if it happens successfully, those could be replicated in other places that are dependent on coal. Now, there are discussions happening in South Africa about what projects to fund. You know, the funders, including the UK, are very clear that they should try and move away from coal. How are those discussions going, and will we see sort of the details of the deal by COP27, you think?
Yes, so it is such an important project, the just energy transition, and it's got to be an energy transition, but it's also got to be done in a just way, you know, as you point out. Lots of challenges in South Africa with employment levels, for example. So the UK is the largest funder, often through guarantees that we've put up. Current status, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, is that the South Africans have now arranged the sort of task group of people who will be leading this, and they are working on putting together their project program. So I'm hoping that we will see that in the next coming months, and definitely before we get to Egypt, and that will then give investors the oversight of what types of projects they can invest in, so we can not only we can use that $8.5 billion and also bring in other investors alongside.
So now we are having these discussions which are quite important about cutting emissions, about moving away from coal, at a moment here in Europe where we are having to rely more on coal, if we can, in places that still have coal power plants left, or having to figure out where we can get access to gas from, because we want to try and reduce imports of gas from Russia. African countries have much wealth in fossil fuels, which they would look at what's happening in Europe and say, why can't we use more of it? So how do you ensure that that is something that they will not tap into, that they can keep in the ground, because there are cleaner, better, cheaper alternatives that they can get access to?
So I think, we've seen this awful illegal invasion of Ukraine. It has had this massive impact on fuel prices across the world. It's really hitting the world's poorest. But it's also reminded us of the need for energy security, okay? And in the UK, that's actually reminded us that actually we need to work towards having more renewables, more new nuclear, as quickly as possible, okay? And I think the same goes for countries all across the world. Obviously, to get to that energy transition, you sometimes use gas as a transition fuel. But actually, we should be accelerating our focus on getting those cleaner, greener energy sources out there as well. We've just seen in the film that we just watched, the devastating environmental impact in Nigeria of fuel theft, illegal fossil fuel extraction. It's one of the reasons why, when I meet the Nigerians, I've not only spoken to them recently about how can they tackle that better, but actually also how can they move on with some of the plans to increase, for example, solar contracts, to diversify. And that, I think, is really, really important. We should be working to diversify those energy sources.
And what specific clean energy projects do you think are sort of highlights that you would say could be replicated in other countries that the UK has been involved in?
So I loved going and seeing the Malindi solar plant in Kenya. It's the East Africa's largest solar production plant. That went online in January, and there's room to expand that as well. It is complex. I don't underestimate that. You need investment in grids as well, which is another thing that we will be looking at. But actually, those sorts of projects we'd love to see replicated in other parts of the world. I mentioned also the one in Niger. They're doing trial work on that massive wind farm there, very windy country that desperately needs electricity.
Now, you mentioned renewables, and obviously that is now pretty much clear to everybody as the cheapest source of electricity that you can get and key to grow. But the UK is also looking at new nuclear here domestically because it allows you to have electricity that is constant, available whenever you want it. Would one of the things that the UK would look to do is help other countries get nuclear after doing?
So obviously, countries will make their own decisions about what they want to do with regards to that. But one of the things that we have in the International Development Strategy is a strategy to have centres of expertise for different. So one of it will be green transformation, so that countries can come to the UK and ask for our advice, how have we seen things, and get that expert advice as well.
Right. And in terms of the sort of, the time that you spend on this portfolio will be limited. What are the things that you would want people to remember for what you've done in your role as minister for, and this is not just Africa, you're also a part of your portfolio, covers Latin America, covers the Caribbean.
So, well, first of all, as a woman minister, I am incredibly proud to be serving a woman foreign secretary. It's only the second time in the world, in our country's history, that we've had a woman foreign secretary. so many times in the past few months of having this job, I've seen how women often bear the brunt of what are very challenging circumstances. So I'm very proud of what the UK has done over recent years in investing in girls' education. That is something I would like to be proud of. We'll be hosting a conference later on this year on the awful impact of sexual violence in war. Ukraine's reminded us of how terrible it is when rape is used as a weapon of war, but actually it's something that I've also heard of from reports in Tigray and Ethiopia. So being able to shift the dial on that, the Foreign Secretary is very clear that she thinks that the use of rape in a war should be considered as much of a red line as using chemical weapons, for example. So that will be, a key thing we'll be working on. Delivering on some of these climate change projects. I'm so proud to have played that little part in the COP conference last November, but we now need to deliver on that. So keeping the focus on that. And also, my background before getting involved in politics was as an infrastructure banker. I've seen how infrastructure really can help change the future for a country. So getting a few more of those infrastructure projects up and running in an honest, reliable, transparent way for the country that's taking our money, so they know, they know what they're signing up to. I'd love to see some of that. But it's a long-term goal, but it's going to be good.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time.